new episode in our series this year. I think we had a pretty good season considering. Today it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Amilcar, Challu, who is an associate professor and chairperson in the Department of History. He's proud of leading a community of scholars engaged in training new professionals to solve real-world problems and lead a successful life in modern professional language. He is an historian of Mexico and Latin America with a broader interest in the Atlantic and world history. Dr. Challu's research is focused on economic and environmental issues, applying methodologies that define those fields, but intersecting them with insights from cultural studies and social history. He uses historical ways of analysis and interpretation in areas that go beyond traditional historical narratives, what some call applied history. This work is translated into the work with local organizations of cultural heritage and conservation, leading curricular initiatives funded with federal grants and being engaged with community events and media. Welcome, Dr. Challu.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me.
Hold on one second.
Yep.
Sorry, audio is not working.
Okay.
Okay, try it again.
Hello. Does that work?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Amilcar Challu. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm sorry that I'm over Zoom, but I had for the last couple of weeks battling bugs, and I've seen the whole community battling these things. But I'm doing very well. But just out of caution, I prefer not to walk the 5 blocks that separate me from the senior center. So thank you for bearing with me in this format, and I hope we have a good time. So what I have is I created like a few handwritten slides to have as a reference in the background, and just a couple of points that this reading triggered in me, not necessarily exhausting anything. I work on topics related to climate history and economic history in the Americas 200 years ago. So climate change to me, it's very, very, very long. But I want to be completely frank. I'm not an expert in this particular topic of the Paris Agreement or international decision making. I'm very interested. I follow it. Back in the day in grad school, I took classes in something called international history, so I'm interested. But I don't see myself as coming with a lot of knowledge that it's very different. So I hope this is more like a dialogue too, and I'm happy to. I mean, as I finish the short presentation I have, that we can bounce ideas back and forth. I wanted to start first also by recognizing a good friend who is no longer here, and he loved this series, Mark Simon. So Mark Simon from the Policy Department, my neighbor in Williams Hall, we would always talk about this series and how much we enjoyed it. So it's hard for me to do this, thinking that, well, I'm not going to be sharing thoughts with him about it. But anyway, we honor the legacy, right, by keeping on. So let me begin. I'm going to share my screen. And let me know if something is not working on your end. There we are. Boom, 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 boom. You can see me scrolling, right?
Yep.
Okay. So here it is: climate change and international cooperation. Here is also my name and my phone number, and an email in case you want to follow up. We live in the age of AI, as one of the presentations is dealing with. So I generated that image. with an AI prompt. And my prompt was, show me frogs boiling, dressed as diplomats, talking around the table. And that's what AI came up with. These 3 frogs in suits and discussing over a boiling pot. But they were supposed to be inside the pot, right? So that's a common analogy for climate change, right? It's this idea of the boiling pot, boiling gradually, the temperature rising gradually. The frogs don't realize that they are being cooked, and boom, then it's too late, right? At the same time, these frogs are diplomats, right? So that was my little take on that. The reading is very interesting in my opinion, very clear, the points that it's making. Sometimes you struggle a little bit with or I struggle with these readings because I want them to have more of a strong point. This is it, you know, and the author like navigated more like the different options, and even though a forceful argument is easier to follow, this type of argument, I think eventually it's really more accurate. We don't know what's going to happen, right? This is unfolding in real time. So let me begin first by going to this first idea that I wanted to share. The first thought that popped up in my head, and it is that climate change is a wicked problem. I love that term, wicked problem. The best way to think about the wicked problem is that it's not Sudoku. It's not a puzzle, right? In Sudoku, we have typically one solution, maybe 2, but typically one solution, the large majority. If there's more than one solution, the editor or the curator of the collection removes the Sudoku. We want to have one solution. And the same thing for the puzzle, right? Or the crossword or the puzzle. There's one solution. And this is what makes these problems and solving these problems so interesting and appealing, right? There is a solution to these problems that we can find. We can put a lot of effort and find the solution to this problem. There may be different levels. I can play Sudoku on Monday and I can do it in, I don't know, in a couple minutes. I can do it on a Sunday. I can spend 30 minutes, right? Or an hour and erasing and starting again. There are levels of difficulty, but these types of problems have a solution. And more importantly, and this to me, it's critical, the rules are stable. Part of the reason why we enjoy Sudoku, puzzles, and crosswords is that the rules are very, very clear. And part of the frustration sometimes when you start a crossword in a different newspaper or in an app or something like that is that they change a little bit the rules, like they change the color to signify something else, and that's frustrating until you get it, and then you operate with those rules. A wicked problem, it's completely different. It's wicked. It doesn't have one solution. There may be multiple solutions to this problem. There may be no solution to a problem. The second thing, the rules keep changing. Imagine that not only there's not a scripted solution, but also what we consider a solution may be different according to how far we are into the game, right? Imagine that you are playing Risk and suddenly you are told you are going to start playing with a die that has 20 sides, not the usual 6. Or imagine now that you're playing Risk again, and now all your units are halved because there was a plague. I don't know, whatever. Or in Sudoku, imagine now that boom, all these numbers disappear. Now what do you do, right? The rules keep changing in a wicked problem. Now, the interesting thing about the wicked problem then is that because things are changing, because it is dynamic, Also because the perception of the different players about the game may be very different. It really demands what people call, or my dad at least called, lateral thinking, coming from the left side, to put it in another way, as the baseball expression is, right? It's you are not anticipating, you should not be anticipating where the solution is going to be coming from. In an issue like climate change that involves so many dimensions, and the article makes a great sense in showing how many different dimensions are in play. In a problem like global change, this entails involving governments, absolutely, but also within the government, central banks, and also the secretaries of the Treasury, but also secretaries of Interior, education, etc. And that's just at the level of government. It demands also the private sector, because eventually some of these solutions will engage some type of technology and investment. You need business to be there. Business operates in a different scale. If it operates at a very, very local scale, and that would be going downtown to Juniper, Grounds for Thought. These are like very local businesses with, even though we don't think about it, with global impact, how they are sourcing their materials and things like that. So from local to the global, like Apple or Google, etc., right? We need to engage them all. We need to engage churches. Churches are fantastic engines of change, right? We need to engage schools. We need to engage organizations, ways that people organize and do things, right? So this type of problem requires lots of people interacting and listening, brainstorming, and then making the decisions to help solve a problem, in the understanding that the solution that you may be getting may not be actually a final solution, maybe hopefully an improvement, but that the rules can change. So wicked problems are by design extremely frustrating, to put it in a way, because of this inability to have a very specific solution. There's no recipe. At the same time, they are extremely stimulating. They are extremely interesting to work with, because this is the real world. In the real world, solutions are never simple, right? Is this all coming all right? Or let me know if I need to change the pace or something. Is it okay? I assume we are okay.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, thank you. So far, I mean, what an introduction, right? The wicked problem, maybe not a solution, goalposts are changing, boom, right? You may, another downer, you may be thinking. Not really. And to me, one interesting feature of being here, or not being here, being virtually here, is your memory, right? It's your memory, your experience. If I were talking to my classroom, my usual audience, 18 to 22 years old, they probably have no experience of global coordination, of a successful solution to a wicked problem. And it would be difficult. Their memory will likely be the pandemic. And it's hard to say. I mean, you can have like a very positive spin on the pandemic, but at the same time, it was a very painful event, right? So in the memory of these 18, 22-year-olds, they may not think about this successful resolution of wicked problems, ways in which we were able to fix it, or at least patch it temporarily. But I wanted to take you back to the 80s, right? I want to take you back to the 80s. I wasn't living here in the 80s. I was in Argentina. which is different in terms of many different things. We were just coming out of a long dictatorship into a democratic regime. The economy was tanking, but we were relatively happy to be rebuilding the country in a way. And I was a teenager back then. The big deal for people of my generation and the big fear, it's a country that has very nice seashore. We will spend, if we could, if we could spend a month on the beach, that would be fantastic. It's a very diverse country in terms of geography too, so you can go to the mountains or not. But the big deal in the 1980s for us was the ozone layer crisis. And I want you to take you back to that, right? And I want you to take you back to the 1980s. I'm not sure exactly what your experience was, but I mean, thinking from the outside, 1980s is also a time of significant political change in the United States, economic change, Good Morning America playing out as well. Lots of new emphasis on entrepreneurialism, free enterprise, and also a change towards more deregulation of the economy. So that's all on the political side, right? But I know too that the ozone layer crisis, the ultraviolet rays from the sun coming down to us without that filtering of the ozone, was also quite important here. And it's not trivial that it was important here. It was a global problem, right? As we started deploying new technologies, particularly refrigeration, the chemicals used in this, CFCs, when they leaked into the atmosphere, they are ozone killers. And ozone is a form of oxygen that it's not suitable for us to healthily breathe, but has some very interesting properties to filtrate the radiation that is coming from outer space, and particularly from the sun. Both Argentina and the United States, I should have had a map here, I forgot, but both Argentina and the United States, we share something too in common, that our geography spans from subtropical areas into not the Arctic Circle, but very far north, right? And the farther or very far away from the equator, sorry, closer to the poles. The closer you go to the poles, the stronger the effect of the depletion of the ozone layer. That being said, the ozone layer, or the depletion of the ozone layer, the so-called ozone hole, was stronger in the southern pole than in the northern pole. Put yourself back there. Did you think that there was a solution to this? And as again, as a teenager with very fragile skin, my doctors basically told me it's not a matter of if, the matter is when you are going to get skin cancer, period. So start like layering yourself in clothes on the beach, like use tons of sunscreen and things like that. Look at what happened, right? We thought that this was unmanageable. How many ways we have to produce CFC? How could you control the production of CFC? How can you tackle this problem with so many actors involved, right? This was a wicked problem. And the most interesting thing is that there was a solution to that, right? And that's called the Montreal Protocol, 1987. I started by reflecting on the political process a little bit. These are the Reagan years well known for deregulation and also for rolling back some of the environmental regulations of the 1970s that involved like paring down the regulations of the EPA, also national parks, more liberal rules in national forests and things like that. So this is an administration that from the very beginning, their priorities were not definitely to advance, if you want, the agenda of preservation. And yet, we have the United States signing the Montreal Protocol and being a leader in the Montreal Protocol as well. So I think there's a lot to learn from the ozone crisis, and the solutions to this were, of course, never perfect. But eventually, there was a cap on the production of CFC and a substitution of technology that was supported by this international agreement. So remember Montreal. That's my first thing. These problems in history are not necessarily unsolvable. We are not always going straight into World War II. We can avoid this history. The joy of this the joy of history is precisely how things play out in ways that we cannot anticipate, in ways that are unexpected. The trick with history too, the mental trick that one needs to have with history, is that when we're looking back at the past, it looks as if the solution was simple and it was very obvious that people were going to get there. As you are playing the game, as you are playing history, replaying history yourself, these solutions are not obvious. So that's my first reflection. Remember Montreal. I'm second, I'm a proud citizen of Bowling Green. I love Bowling Green. And one of my favorite places is this one I have here, Winter Garden, St. John's Woods. Remember that we were talking about the 1980s. St. John Woods came into existence in the early 1990s. I mean, the plan in the early 90s, or the first stages. Again, recall the political scenario, right, that we are talking about, particularly the crisis in federal environmental funding, the crisis in, or the paring down of policies in national parks, etc. However, this period is also the peak moment of something called the land trust movement. It's a private movement, or a movement of individuals, citizen groups, organizations that are acquiring land that has a special restoration value, that may have a special community value. It's acquiring them and keeping them for the joy of the people and generations of people to come, and for keep people closer to natural environments. They are not Yellowstone by design. They are little things like St. John Woods that started with, I think, 50, 60 acres, and eventually today it has 120 acres, right? So two takeaways from remembering Winter Garden and St. John Woods, and I wasn't here back in these days at all. So, but I studied the history of St. John, so that's why I'm very, very interested in it. Two things. One is the pendular nature of politics, right? Yes, things may be moving one way, but also they tend to move the other way. Actually, you cannot talk about the 80s in terms of environmental policies of deregulation without the 1970s. The 80s are sort of a correction, right? So it's a pendular nature that we have. We have at the federal level this happening, at the local level something else may be happening, right? And that's the other second point, that local action matters, and matters a lot, even in global issues, in global problems. And that was my second point or my third point that I wanted to make. And this is the final one. When I think about stuff like this on climate change, and when I think a lot about the discourse about climate change, there are two concepts that I have in mind. And these are lofty or words that can acquire very specific meanings. And in general, I prefer smaller words, but these two are very useful to me. One concept is the concept of vulnerability. really the climate or any natural disaster on its own really doesn't matter. What matters is how vulnerable the population that is experiencing it is to that phenomenon. Let me give you like a very simple example. If we are living on a tectonic plate subject to earthquakes, and we are living all in tents, our risk of an earthquake, it's very, I mean, I imagine that this is like a very earthquake prone area. Our risk of suffering from an earthquake is very limited, right? Because we are living in tents. We are not. It's all good?
All good?
Yep.
Yep,
Yeah, I
okay.
think so.
Yep, okay.
Yeah.
We are not stacked up on multi-story buildings. We don't have big towers that can crumble and crash upon us. The biggest risk is going to be if there's like a crack on the ground, right? And boom, we fall inside the crack. It may happen, but there is a reason why everything we know, for instance, about the Valley of Mexico, an area that is very vulnerable to earthquakes, that anything we know about earthquakes dates from the colonial period and on. Because before the colonial period, the type of building that they had was single story, non-vaulted ceilings. I'm not saying that it was a piece of cake to go through an earthquake, but it wasn't really, it didn't put the society at risk. Now, put on top of that now, three-story buildings, cathedrals, palaces, towers here and there, and now an earthquake is a social crisis, right? The same area that experienced very little of this natural disaster called an earthquake, by nature of a change in the city, changed dramatically. It became something very different. They became vulnerable to earthquakes. The same if we are dealing with our own San Andreas fault line, right, on the West Coast, right? Part of the vulnerability of all the part of the problem is that we are very vulnerable because we have big cities. We need to have very good codes of building and things like that. Think about tsunamis. Tsunamis have been in the history of the planet from the very beginning, ever since we have tectonic plates. But they have become much more of an issue because we now live very close to the shorelines. We have building technology, and we can make shorelines much more habitable. And we love living by the sea. Right now, we have tons of people that are living below the tsunami lines. And that's why it makes a lot of the Northwest Pacific coast very vulnerable to tsunamis, right? It's not that the tsunami is something new. It is that now we are more vulnerable to that. So that's the point that I have there, that social organization, economics, technology, the community, how the community can work things out themselves. All these influence how we experience these events in the natural world. They also influence how we adapt to them, how we survive them, maybe even how we thrive through them, right? And those last three words, how we adapt, how we survive, how we may even thrive, that's what the term resilience means, right? And resilience is that social capacity to deal with hard conditions, to survive, but also to adapt and to reproduce themselves over time, keep the society going over time, pass on the legacy to our next generations, right? So these are key concepts, because when we think about the natural world and we think about climate change and things like that, we are very tied to to this thought that that this is beyond our control. And I would fault also some scientist colleagues on this, and some historians too, that they tend to present anything related to climate change in inevitable terms. This will happen. And when it happens, boom, it's game over, right? No, this will happen. Yes, this is happening. Yes, it is happening right now. We are already almost 2.5 Fahrenheit degrees above our average that we experienced over our human history. And this has consequences. But what the consequences are, that's what's very difficult to see exactly how things play out. And what the unintended consequences of our corrections, of our adaptations are, that's also very difficult to predict. So instead, if we focus on how we deal with this, right, it's to me a much more productive way of looking at climate change than just thinking, hey man, we are screwed, game over, right? Whatever we do, it's just delaying. And those were my main points. And I realized that I also forgot one final point that I wanted to make closer at the beginning, or to begin with. And what's unique about this climate change in a historical perspective? We humans have lived through climate change from all our life. In fact, our evolutionary design and our main evolutionary branches have all to do with the climate. We began as a species in an interglacial moment, were affected by 4 glaciation phases. During each glaciation phases, there were huge migrations. One of them brought people, 2 of them, brought people into the Americas. To start with, there were no Homo sapiens here 20,000, 25,000 years ago. They came here because of an interglacial, because of a glacial period that facilitated the migration and also pushed people away from cold areas and trying to find other areas to adapt, survive, and thrive. So our evolution is marked by climate change. The entire evolution of the planet is climate change. Humans have had an impact on the planet from day one. We can see the impact of burning forests at a very fast pace around the time of the Roman Empire. We can see the impact of that big population growth happening early in our current era. We can see the impact of that in ice cores in the Antarctic continent. We can see the impact of humans inhabiting this planet. Sometimes it's a bad impact, sometimes it's a good impact. The thing is, it's unpredictable impact, right? But we have had an impact all over history. We have experienced even cycles of temperature increasing and decreasing because of human impact. When the Black Plague affected practically the entire, not practically, the entire old world was affected by pest epidemics from the 1200s to the 1400s. The depopulation of Earth at that point, the human depopulation of Earth, brought back a lot of forest coverage that helped retain a lot more oxygen, a lot more carbon, lower the content of carbon dioxide on the atmosphere, and lower the temperature. We call the 1200s or the 1400s to the 1700s the Little Ice Age, 300 years of lower temperature overall on average. That changed a lot of the world. To a large extent today, we eat herrings because of people being able to fish for these little fish in this era. So what I wanted to say is climate change has been in the DNA of humanity. It has been part of our social buildup cultural buildup from the very beginning. So am I saying that present day climate change is different? Well, yes. The big difference, and as we keep going on time, the big difference is going to be the magnitude, and that's going to be coming. I mean, that's physics and chemistry playing its way. We are right now, as I said, at least 2.5 Fahrenheit degrees above the average temperature that we have experienced as humans. Even when we are talking about the Little Ice Age on a global scale, that fluctuation in temperature is, let me close my share screen. That increase in that change in temperature was about 1 Fahrenheit degree, not the 2.5 Fahrenheit degrees that we are talking about right now. The other, so the magnitude is going to be different. Already is different than the magnitude of what we had experienced before. But the most important issue, the most important difference between this climate change and climate change in the past is the acceleration of change. As I mentioned with the Little Ice Age, in order to have that impact of 1 Fahrenheit coming out of the Black Plague, of the depopulation of Earth due to the Black Plague, that played out over 200, 300 years, right? To have 1 Fahrenheit degree change in global temperature. This 2.5 Fahrenheit degrees change that we are currently experiencing, this change started with the Industrial Revolution. We are talking about 150 years, basically, from the 1880s, even 1900 to the present. We already have experienced change that it's twice faster, not twice, 3-4 times faster than before, and it's going to keep accelerating. So the big idea here about climate change, it's not so much that change is new. Change is in our DNA, period. We are used to that. The big difference is how fast this change is happening. And the acceleration of change, it's definitely a major trigger of social conflict. And that's what makes people very anxious. That's what demands quick answers. And human societies are not designed for quick answers. We are very complex societies, right? We have multiple centers of power. What the author of this article calls, we have complex regimes, decentralized. It's not paradoxical that in an environment like this, in a cultural, social, climatic environment like this, part of what many people want to change is precisely the regime. It's trying to make the decision making way more centralized so that decisions are taken faster, and so then that you have more control over the world you're living in, right? And that centralization of power comes at a lot of risk, right? And a lot of tension. So anyway, that's to me as a historian, the big difference between this climate change and climate change in the past is climate change has always happened. We experienced as a species 4 waves of glaciation, right? However, the rate of change is the dramatic thing, the acceleration of change. Anyway, that's it. I'm ready for questions, comments, and if you don't have questions, I have some questions.
So you talked about global warming and climate change. Could you speak a little bit more about international cooperation?
Yeah. Yes, because I hadn't talked much about it. Right? I focus more on the climate change part. International cooperation, it's in itself, regardless of the subject, it's in itself a wicked problem because we have multiple parties. I mean, typically different nation states. And at the same time that we have multiple nation states, each nation state is not like a monoblock. It's not that the United States has just one way to look at it, right? A corporation headquartered in the United States, say IBM, may have very different goals, or Ford Motors may have very different goals than the government of the United States. Moreover, civic organizations may have very different goals and perspectives than the government and than IBM or the business world. Within the business world, it's also very different if we are dealing with, say, IBM and we are dealing with Ford Motors, right? For Ford Motors, I mean, the transition to electrification it's a challenge to the business, right? So they are rightfully concerned about regulations that would require to very quickly adapt the whole technology. For IBM, on the other hand, which operates some of the biggest clouds and artificial intelligence we have, but they typically don't show up much in Google searches. For IBM, it's the other way around. They are much more invested on quick electrification of everything, and even more adding their computer power to all solution making. So international cooperation, the problem is that the word itself, international, not only means different nations, but means many different actors within these nations and between these nations. So when we are looking at these COP events, the COP events, the so-called conferences of parties that are taking place annually, and we see the roster of attendance, I mean, 80,000 people attending a summit. I mean, it's ridiculous. The Political Science Association meeting in the US, the biggest one in the world, like brings together 5,000 people. The American Historical Association, between 3,000 and 5,000 people, right? Like a developer conference for Apple or Meta or Google may bring 10, 20,000 people, right? 80,000 people in the same room, right? It's not the same room, the same city. It's crazy, right? So international cooperation in itself is complicated, regardless of the matter. However, it happens, and it solves problems, right? And Montreal Protocol is precisely an example that international cooperation worked. Again, the solutions may not be ideal. I do recall, I was about 18 years old when this was ratified, 18, 19. There was not clear a perspective that this was going to work, right? I mean, it's not that yeah, we found it, now let's celebrate. No. But yeah, in hindsight, we see that things work. Look, we came in 1945 from the first use of thermonuclear bombs, and from that point on, we had lived in the risk of nuclear proliferation and things like that. But until the 1990s, I mean, international cooperation helped with a lot of limitations and problems, but helped to curb proliferation as well, right? Where the incentives are aligned in a way that really, I mean, this was a feast, a truly feat. So international cooperation can happen, and sometimes it's not like a very cheerful cooperation. Quite often, it's not, the results we see are not the results that make everybody happy. And that's not the outcome of cooperation. Cooperation is not so much about making everybody happy, but making the trade-offs that allow to adapt, survive, right? Thrive sometimes, but yeah. So I think in the present moment, with all the geopolitical realignment that we are seeing in real time, I hadn't opened the newspaper today, and I don't know what it's going to be like. With all this dramatic change happening right now, of course, I mean, international cooperation thinks, okay, it's in the back burner. How is that ever going to happen, right? Let's focus on very specific things. Just let's get these wild bike paths here, right? And let's not think about the world. But it does. It's still, people are cooperating. People still are in dialogue. Governments have to talk with each other. Governments need each other. And maybe it's not a high-profile level of cooperation, but people still keep those connections, right? And across the world, and things, even though they look like we are in a very different stage, and we are, the things can happen in unexpected ways, right? And that to me is a big lesson from history. It's that don't be very possessed by your ability to predict what is going to happen tomorrow, because history always surprises, and humanity always surprises us. And I go back to the pendular analogy that I started before, right? At the same time that we have lower investment in national parks, we have the land trust movement at the local level, right? And if I have to think overall, in the 80s and 90s and early 90s, I wouldn't say that this was a moment in which we went back in time in terms of preservation. Quite the contrary. I think that we spread out the different avenues of preservation. Anyway, sorry, long answer.
First of all, it seems like, well, in the book, they reported that China has the highest emissions, but they don't seem to ever do per capita. China has more than 4 times as many people as the United States. So per capita would show the United States much higher than other nations. And it kind of makes us, along with some other political stuff, okay, China is the biggest problem, when that really isn't true. And we've been the biggest problem for decades, because the Industrial Revolution came here before much of the rest of the world. And I think we need to realize that we're too selfish and we have to fix it. And then the response, well, hey, I'm old. World War II, our country was pushed to help the efforts. People had big gardens in their backyards. Cut the grass and planted vegetables and helped feed the world. It's like, so that's one of the problems, I think, is the way that it's reported to make us feel complacent, and not the biggest problem. And another is I've heard for decades now that a big problem with the global warming is the problem that the pollinators might evolve at a different rate from the plants they pollinate. I don't. Food is going to go out of style very soon, or we're going to learn to eat rocks, right? And the third one is war. I've heard it, and is it true that war is kind of exempt from the agreements? And war is one of the biggest problems. It's like a waste of everything that we ought to be working for. The production of the armaments, the use of the rebuilding of what they destroy, are all contrary to what we ought to be, what we ought to have goals So it seems to me that we should be pushing for diplomacy. I mean,
Mhm.
other- humanity's gonna become extinct. And I probably won't be
Yeah.
here to see. Okay,
Yeah. So to make sure that I got it right, your first point is how we count, how we account for these metrics, whether it's total or per capita or over time or in the present, matters a lot in building perceptions of who is responsible for what. Your point about complacence, right? Complacency. And the second is more like a biology question, right? That the species reactions to climate change may be different from one another, and that may be compounding the issues. And the third is war, right? And the impact of war in all this, right? In the possibility of international cooperation, in further destruction, etc. Did I get the 3 points right? Like complacency, coevolution, and war, right? So assuming a yes, let me begin with the one that makes me happier, and that's coevolution. I love that thought, right? That that the speed of adaptation is very different from one species to another. I love that. I mean, actually the whole field that studied that was called natural history. Right now, it's more like in between paleobiology and anyway, or evolutionary biology. But it's a great point, and that's part of the big problem, the wicked problem, right? This is not just a social problem. This is not just a physics problem or chemistry problem of how much CO2, its carbon dioxide, is in the atmosphere and how much we heat up. This is this is a very complex, right, interaction in between the natural world, in between between physical forces, in between multiple species that have different rates of adaptation, and between our species, right, that also has like a coordination problem, right? We are a social species, but we don't act like ants. Each one goes in a different way. Absolutely. So these feedback mechanisms are the things we don't know. And we don't know if the answer is great or the answer is worse, right? The solution is or the next step is hard to anticipate. You are right that things evolve at different rates, in particular when you have like an environmental pressure, environmental stress, and climate change is an environmental stress that puts a lot of pressure on evolutionary mechanisms. Why? Because those individuals that are less adapted are going to be living less, and those who are adapted are going to be reproducing more, and they are going to be slowly taking over. That's why if we were in the 1960s, I think early 70s, I bet that you thought that you never again were going to see an American elm again, right? And today, just walking Winter Garden, it's packed with American elms. The problem is they don't live longer, right? Why? Because as they live longer, they are susceptible to Dutch elm disease, and boom, right? We don't know with the ash what's going to happen with what white ash and all the ash population that has been decimated, even disappeared in the last 10 years, 15 years. I mean, when I came here, there were ash all over, right? Right now, I'm walking in Winter Garden in a forest where I can see all the ash, the trunks of ashes on the ground, right? It's amazing, right? From thinking, wow, within 10 years, we lost all these trees of a single species. The thing is with ash, we know that some survive. right? And it's likely also the dynamics of these diseases. They work like as if they were masks. They come in waves, and then the population of the trees rebuild, and then they come back again, and so forth. So these mechanisms can change. The thing is that evolution works typically over long periods of time. Environmental pressures accelerate evolution, but each species, each genus, in a more generally speaking, it's going to have very different ways to adapt over change, and how much they can adapt over change. They can adapt to these external pressures. So yes, to your point, absolutely. You are absolutely right. And you are absolutely right also in pointing out pollinators, because this may be a big change. If we are losing pollinators, and pollinators co-evolve with flowers, period, and plants. They have been like working in tandem all the time. If they stop working in tandem and they boom, it's not just that we're going to miss the beauty of a bergamot. We're going to miss the beauty of phlox, like early in the spring, or the joy of seeing all the asters coming in the fall, right? We are going to, perhaps that's the aesthetic loss, but also the loss is that pollination is at the foundation of our food system. We depend on pollination basically to eat, right? So that may be a compounding factor, right? That accelerates things. That's the other issue I feel with being so obsessed with the headline number, 2 degrees or 1.5 degree Celsius, right? I mean, that would be 3 Fahrenheit or 4.5 Fahrenheit degrees of global change. That really doesn't matter that much, because we already know in the last 20 years, our global temperature changed by about 0.5 Fahrenheit degrees on average, global average. That change on its own accelerated, triggered a lot of coevolutionary changes that you have been pointing out. So coevolution is a big factor. One, makes sense what I'm saying, or
Yes,
or
Dr. Challu.
So-
I'm pretty sure I understand some of the things that you said. So you mentioned that climate change has occurred multiple times in the past, but that climate change occurred at least 100, if not 1,000 times slower than the climate change that's currently happening.
yes.
And you mentioned the climate change that occurred due to the bubonic plague in the Middle Ages, but I think a lot of climate scientists wouldn't really the climate change because only at most representative of 1/10 to 2/10 decline in average global temperature, whereas we've experienced in just the last 100 years,
Yes.
1.5 degree Celsius increase in temperature, and average temperature last year was higher than the last 2 million years.
Yeah.
Enormously more rapid temperature increases that are certain to result in large increases in levels of in sea level and inundate lots of areas, cause land and where crops can be grown and lots of other. This is dramatically different from the climate change in the past. I want to know.
Yeah. I absolutely agree, and I put that at the end because I was thinking, wow, I'm not getting the point across that this is different, and it's the acceleration. Absolutely, that's a big deal. And I mean, historians like me, we debate a lot about when the acceleration started and when the acceleration became even more accelerated. The big consensus is that from the post-war on, that's what we call the Great Acceleration. And absolutely, I cannot disagree with you at all. I just want to put like one little wrench because I do think we have not had experienced this in our lifetimes. And when you have like a big volcanic blow up, that's a big, fast change in world climate. Basically, you pump a lot of sulfur, a lot of ash into the atmosphere, creating a layer that is preventing UV rays. The temperature lowers dramatically over the entire world for a period of 2, 3, 5 years, right? This happened in 1812. So sometimes in the war of 1812, when you are hearing the descriptions of the brutal winter, it's because we are after Tambora, after a big blow up in Indonesia. And it's the time when we are starting to realize as humanity that this event happening in Indonesia is affecting us here. In Mexico too, 1785, 76, these are years of famine. 1781 was a big volcanic blow up, like on the other side of the world. And that decreased global temperatures for 4 or 5 years. So you are absolutely correct that at a planetary scale, this is absolutely unprecedented. Absolutely, and the directionality, it's not going to change anytime soon. And it's very, very, very fast compared to anything in human scale. Over time, over our experience, typically our climate change is experienced at a smaller rate, but there are like some periods, some moments in which we do have like this reckoning that the weather today or the climate today is very different than it was for my parents, or very different than it was even 10 years ago. It didn't last that long. And so culturally, we were adapted to those climate cycles. We had ways to think about it. Perhaps the most familiar way to think about it is the 7 plagues, right? The Bible story about 7 years of plague, 7 years of dearth, 7 years of abundance. That's humanity's wisdom of what weather would look like, right? If the Bible, we are rewriting it today, probably we wouldn't use the same analogy of 7 years of dearth, 7 years of abundance. We may say like, yeah, gradually more and more dearth, right? And if we were writing this in the 1970s, probably the other way around. No, more abundance over time, right? So yes, acceleration is the big difference, historically speaking.
So can you hear me all right? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
A couple things. One, somebody asked about international cooperation, and I think it's kind of a good thing to point out that as a result of the Paris Agreement, a lot of countries have moved in the direction of sustainability. I think there's like 9 countries right now that are essentially 100% renewable. And some countries like Portugal have made huge strides in switching over to wind and solar power. And Australia, about 40% of the rooftops in Australia now have solar panels. People put them on themselves. And that kind of brings me to my difficult question I'm going to ask you. And talked about the what happened with the woods here, you know, the local effort that resulted in a lot of preservation. Well, the local effort, one of the most effective local things people can do in their own lives is to mount solar panels on their roofs. I mean, we have Australia where they completely eliminated peak demand, which has prevented millions of tons peak point where hottest when people are running their air conditioning most historically have created huge surges of carbon
Not anymore in Australia, because those are the same hours that the solar panels are putting more
Mhm.
power. So, my question for you is sort of a two-part question. One, what do you think of policies like Bowling Green's penalty on rooftop solar, where they charge $4 per installed kilowatt every month,
Mhm.
which squash solar power installations in the city of Bowling Green? And two, you mentioned there's a temptation to drift towards a more totalitarian state, a more centralized authority. But around the world, it seems like the most centralized economies are the ones that are doing the worst in terms of responding to the problem of climate change. Like I think in Saudi Arabia, Russia, even China, they're the countries that seem to be putting most carbon in and making the transition the slowest compared to the other, like, more democratic countries like Portugal, like Australia. So two-part question.
Mhm. So, on the one hand, the quality of life, what it means, this transition in the quality of life at the local level, and on the other hand, these differences that we see in adaptation in different political environments. I got it. And so, I mean, again, like in all comments, it's hard for me to say that not hard. I fully agree. I'm just adding, like, and right. I love your points on locally, right? Because a lot of the change is local and adds up, and adds up in many different ways. Adds up because little changes, I mean, add up incrementally on the atmosphere, but also little changes change the way that you imagine solutions, right? So if we are thinking that this is so difficult that it's impossible to solve, a local solution actually helps a lot to see, wow, yes, there are ways in which we can move a little step forward, in which we can get together. So the power of a local solution, it's not proportional to the size of the solution. I think, I mean, I moved to Bowling Green in 2005, and I love Bowling Green, and I have immersed my life here, enjoy every corner of Bowling Green. Like any place that we live in, as you love it, you are also develop frustrations, right? And I know that the tax per, or the fee on solar panels is looks like a very pity point. I mean, there is like an economic reason, I agree, but makes you think, well, can we, subsidize something like this or not? However, I do want to point something out here, right? It's first the sheer economics of the cost of solar panels going down in and on itself. It's a big incentive for solar, or for other forms of alternative energy. The other big issue is battery storage, right? And that's where I think we are going to be seeing the big changes coming up. It's as we develop other forms of battery storage that are right now piloted, and we don't know where they are going. For any energy grid issue, you have two things, right? On the one hand is scalability. It always saves money to scale things up. So each of us putting a solar panel on the roof, per installed capacity, per dollar invested, is much less efficient than, say, doing the solar farm field that we have off Carter Farm, or on Carter Road. So the economics are something to bear in mind, because for a city that is managing the budget and things like that, they are always going to be thinking, right? It's what's the most efficient way of doing this, right? And it is frustrating. Why? Because I do think that each of us having a solar panel in our roofs, it's in itself transforming the landscape and transforming our attitudes. Each one of us is on this together, right? So I think it has a practical value. It lowers the bills, but it also has like a symbolic value. That is, we are transforming and it's very interesting when you are going in a different country and you are seeing like Germany, even in higher latitudes than this, and you have all these roofs with solar panels, or Scotland, right? And in Scotland, you cannot see like a parking lot without solar roofs. It's ridiculous. Here we have to go to the Toledo Museum of Art to find something like this. The Toledo Zoo has like one row of parking that it's covered with solar panels. I don't know, maybe that's changing faster. While here, basically, in Bowling Green, I don't know, we have an incapacity to think in that way. But there are other ways, other things that are important. Electricity depends on several sources, and as you put it too, whether you have peak demand or not is important. And that's one issue. We may be generating a lot of energy that may go into waste because we don't have a way to store it. So typically what one wants to do is to diversify the sources, right? You want to have electricity, you want to have solar, absolutely. And that's great from average 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. over the year, right? More in the summer, less in the winter. But you also want to have wind, right? Wind does not change that much during the day and night. So you have like steady production of wind. And when you have a peak demand, what are you going to do? Well, that's where something like gas or coal typically is helpful. The cleaner solution would be a hydroelectrical dam. But that has also other environmental impacts. Another more controversial solution, which I wish were not that controversial, it's nuclear plants as well. But anyway, it's the portfolio that matters a lot. That's why, folks like Neoclis Leontis was so mad about putting all the chips on a deal with with the coal power company, because it was locking us in the portfolio. And that plant would be great for high demand and not so great for other uses, right? But we are committed to buying from that for a long while. Now, I know that things have changed that direction too, but but you said quality of life, and I love it because that's what I study. I study quality of life over time and what it means living a good life. I can say one thing too, is that all these climate change, these habits that build resilience to climate change go way beyond energy. Energy is super important, don't get me wrong. But waiting 5 minutes on Worcester and Maine on a day where it's 20 Fahrenheit, and I did that walk, I do that walk on a daily basis. Waiting 5 minutes there makes me want to go in a car to my job rather than walking, even though I'm 15, 20 minutes away. But those 5 minutes waiting in the cold to get the green light for the pedestrian to cross, because don't dare crossing that street without the light or cars don't stop for you, right? So that's more like a habit change. If we can get more people to walk, that reduces our carbon footprint immensely per capita. That's a point that the other question made about, the person made about complacency and China. You're absolutely right. On a per capita basis, we spend so much CO2, and we put so much at an individual basis on the atmosphere, way more than many than other countries of the similar development level or lower development level, right? Those are changes that go again, are more everyday life changes that are quite important, right? And means making some people mad, unfortunately. That means that I love having my two-way street here on Everly Avenue, but if we want bike lanes eventually, or more pedestrian-friendly spaces, maybe this has to be one way, like in 95% of the world, right? We lose some freedom, but we gain in other things. And those trade-offs are the very complicated trade-offs to make, right? And that's how I always get into arguments. I love picking some battles on that with my fellow Bowling Green folks, right? Because everybody gets so riled up about bike lanes and things like that, and I do. But little changes like that are extremely influential. I do recall I mentioned Neoclis before, Neoclis Neontis. He had a calculation of the footprint, how much we put CO2 on the atmosphere. There are things that really, at an individual level, don't make that much of a change, like composting, but using the car is one of these big contributors, right? And it has a lot to do with the way that our whole society, not just Bowling Green, our whole society is built around the car. And there are efficiencies from an economic point of view that are great. But just to give you an idea, in the other places in the world I lived in, Mexico City, Argentina, Buenos Aires, San Luis Potosí, now Montevideo, a little bit, the fact that you have a grocery store every 2 blocks, it's a game changer. The fact that I can get fresh produce 2 blocks away or 1 block away changes everything. I don't need to drive to the Kroger, Walmart, etc., have a big parking lot to find a place for my car. And I can just walk 2 blocks to make dinner for tonight. If I don't have, I would go to make a big purchase once a month with the car, but then for immediate things, no, right? So those are daily life habits that also change dramatically the way we impact our local environment and our planet as well. To me, one of the most interesting things when I see a student in BGSU coming back from study abroad is how much they start to imagine that life can be very different, right? This guy who came back from Hiroshima and Tokyo came fascinated by the fact that he didn't need a car, that they lived, I don't know, a whole month there, and they didn't need a car. They could do their whole life, and it's not that they were driven from one place to another. They could do everything, like just in a compact city by walking. That changes in imagination was dramatic for this student. He used to drive from his house on the near Carter Park. He used to drive from Carter Park to campus before that experience, and then he realized maybe I don't need to, right? Anyway, I'm getting off track. Oh, the other question was on centralized, and that it's very different, the experience in different regimes. Yes, and that's a tricky one. In a higher, I mean, China is very difficult to pin down to what the regime is about. I mean, we know it's authoritarian. We do know that the central power has a very strong grip. At the same time, at the local level, there's a lot of alignment with the Communist Party. They have to be aligned, but there's also, they are like local lords in a way. They have a lot of initiative. China is a very interesting case because it's developing so fast that it's a major contributor, maybe not per capita, but overall. 31, I thought, that's what I read, 30-something% of all emissions are today coming from China because they depend critically on coal, which is also a resource they have available in China. Very that they have a lot of supply of that. So at the same time, China is a country that is moving to renewables at a much faster rate, and they have industrial capacity that helps scaling up production of solar panels. It's difficult. It's difficult to compare these countries. Also, the politics can change dramatically. Australia, absolutely. Transition going on. At the same time, depending on who is in the government, they can be very recalcitrant to cooperation as well. I would like to say that, I mean, my personal bias would be that freedom and quality of life and making changes for a more sustainable future are correlated, but life is complicated. The incentives for China to move to renewables go way beyond their incentives just in terms of quality of life. It has to do with their whole industrial strategy. Also think that China is trying to take the place that the US is leaving behind. China is invested in moving into a two-polar world where they are one of the poles. They want to be back to the Cold War, except that instead of being Russia and the US or Soviet Union, it's China and maybe US and the, well, that's too old already. I was going to say the EU or the European Union, but so China is trying to move to a more central stage. She has been moving in that direction for decades, and now they have like a huge opportunity to do it for the last couple decades. And so for them to be very at the forefront of renewables investments, an issue that for third world countries is very important. Then they are also occupying a space in the world that other powers are leaving behind.
Questions? I think we got one more question.
This is Joan Challu. One of my pet peeves is the left turn red arrow. I would like to see that after green, the left turn arrow, when other traffic starts on a green light, that it go to the flag in yellow. And not keep the people in the left lane sitting there when there's opportunity or clearance to turn left.
I'm sorry, but the question didn't, I couldn't hear the question well. Can you repeat?
Sorry, the left turn arrow at an intersection, instead of going from green to red, go from green to flashing yellow when regular traffic hits the green light. Rather than standing there and when there's a clearance to turn.
I'm sorry, but I still didn't, the red arrow in the lights, you mean, but I didn't get, or the.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can, yeah.
Her question was, for energy efficient standpoint, why spend more time with, say, traffic lights and whatever?
Yeah.
Give them a yellow, or why don't we look at little things like that?
Yeah, I get it now. Yes, absolutely. Yes, those changes scaled up. They are very, very significant. Of course, we always need to balance safety, right, and the and efficiencies, right. I think I mean, I'm again not an expert, right, but I have followed a little bit discussions in urbanism and things like that. The rotary is a very good concept, and not having the car idling is important. As we move to electric cars, that becomes less and less and less and less important, because at that point, an electric car really does not have that much penalty for stalling. So what I'm saying is that this may change already in 10, 20 years. But I get the point, and particularly in big cities that deal with smog, this is a big concern. So for instance, I can give you the case of Mexico City, that it's in a valley that where the smog is trapped in between very big mountains, or LA would be a similar case in some ways, when you have all these greenhouse and toxic gases piled up in a valley, in an enclosed area. Every little thing to keep the traffic flowing is good. So Mexico has built a lot of, say, highways in Mexico City to keep the traffic flowing and avoid stalling. That's good from an individual point of view, an individual car point of view. The problem with all that is that if it takes me, say, just making this up, if it takes me, say, 30 minutes to go to Toledo, and I have to stop like 4 times or 5 times now on 25 with all these new lights, right? But I do it 30 minutes on 25 to get to Toledo. Now, imagine that I find a more efficient way to have like a constant green wave from here to downtown Toledo, and I can cut the time to 20 minutes, to 15 minutes or 10 minutes. Still, myself today is willing to spend 30 minutes to do that trip, right? And I cut it in half, 15 minutes. What am I going to do, right? Maybe I'm going to go to Toledo more frequently, right? And I'm going to increase the traffic to Toledo. So this solution, which is like, yeah, let's stall less, let's make things more efficient that way, because I was already predisposed to spend 30 minutes in traffic, and now it takes 15 minutes, then it also creates an incentive for me to use the car more, right? To use, now I'm going to go twice a week to Toledo because it's easier than ever, right? And that's a big problem. It's the more infrastructure we build for cars, the more traffic we get, and we quickly get back to that clogged roadways. So in urbanism, the big theory is that, or one line of thought, is that actually it doesn't help to create more lanes. It doesn't help to make the traffic flow better. If you make it more difficult to drive, not to drive, but to make it more time consuming to drive, to find a parking spot, etc., then you encourage people more to use alternative means to transportation. I mentioned that now I walk to campus every day, right? And does it have to do with environmental consciousness? Maybe a little bit. My neighbor also pushes me that, oh, right, why you are driving and walking. Yes, there's a little bit of that thing, that, but primarily it's because it's so hard to find a place to park on campus that it takes me 5 minutes anyway, right? So even if I'm saving 10 minutes driving, still we are comparing 10 minutes versus 20 minutes, right? Still, if you add a couple more red lights in the road from here to campus, right? Probably my incentive to walk is going to be even more, right? So it's a complicated thing what you are pointing out about the traffic lights and increasing the efficiencies there. You are right, the emissions go down per car, but it also makes us more and more and more reliant on using the car. And that's a whole thing. There are other possibilities, right? Like say the city of Holland in Michigan invested huge in warming up. They had excess capacity from a coal plant or a natural gas plant. They had excess capacity, a lot of heat produced that they were like sending up to the atmosphere. Instead, they repiped the exhaust and the way that the heat is dissipated to power water lines underneath downtown Holland. And right now, everybody is walking in Holland. I mean, and if you're retiring in Holland, Michigan, it's great. You are going to have like retirement houses are closer to downtown, people are walking, people can have, so the whole culture changed because there was a more investment on making downtown at least more walkable. Those are the trade-offs. Is it expensive? Absolutely, right? But that's how we citizens decide how our taxes go and how much we get taxed, right? Anyway, again, a long answer. I'm sorry. I need to work on my conciseness.
There any other questions? No? All right, thank you, we appreciate it, that's all we got.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, and thank you for the patience and the bubbling head on the big screen, I imagine. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye bye.